All right, if you would be opening your Bibles up to 2 Samuel chapter 21. Get this adjusted real quick. All right. Remember that last week we talked about that the death of Absalom did not mean that everything was restored to normal, we might could say, between the northern part of Israel and the southern part, primarily Judah. And the end result of that is there was another sort of smaller rebellion that is sort of launched against David because of the events at the end of chapter 19. And that rebellion is ultimately put down, as we saw. But one of the bigger things that comes out of that chapter is the fact that the relationship between the northern and the southern kingdoms in Israel would not necessarily go back to being completely unified. And that again will come out following the death of Solomon when you get into the book of 1 Kings. But when we come to chapter 21, chapters 21 through 24 are sort of the ending section of this book. Remember that 1 and 2 Samuel was originally written as one book. In our Bibles it's divided into two, but originally it was one. And these four chapters are basically some have called it the epilogue of the book of Samuel. And one of the things that we'll note about these chapters, and probably in particular for sure chapter 21, is that the events of chapter 21 are not following along in chronological order. So it's not as though the events of chapter 21 occur right after the events of chapter 20 with Sheba's rebellion. More than likely, the events of chapter 21 that we'll read about occurred earlier in David's reign as king, which is again why this is sort of looked at as a different section than what we have been looking at so far in 2 Samuel. And this section that we'll look at this morning, looking to get down through verse 14, we are looking primarily at the relationship between Israel and a group of people called the Gibeonites. And if you don't know who they are, we're going to talk about them a little bit more as we get into class. But one of the things that we want to focus on in this section is that God expects of his people to keep their promises. You know, we know that God is a God who's promised us a lot of things. You look through the Old Testament, he promised his followers, he promised Abraham, he promised the people of Israel a lot of things, right? If you're faithful to me, you think about the promises given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, right? You'll be a great people. You will have a great name for yourself. Through you all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Think about those promises. We think about in the book of, in particular, I believe Exodus and Numbers, and I guess really in Deuteronomy, where God is very specific that, you know, when you enter into the land of Canaan, if you're faithful to me, everything's going to go well. That's a promise that God gave to the Israelites. And God, of course, expected Abraham to do what he said. God expected the Israelites to do exactly what he said. And as long as they did that, they upheld their end of the promise, things would be well for them. Now we know, of course, in the New Testament that there's also an emphasis put on making sure that we keep the promises of God, whether that's in relationship to our position as a Christian in our relationship to God, or whether that's our position, you know, as a Christian with other human beings. I believe Jesus said, when he talks about, you know, communication and oaths, right? Let your yes be yes, let your no be no. You're people of your word. You keep your promises. And that's really what the focus is on in chapter 21, verses 1 through 14. At least the point of application that you want to think about in this section is the idea that God values when promises are kept. And that's what he expects of us. That's going to be the problem that Israel encounters in chapter 21. So let's begin 2 Samuel chapter 21, looking at verses 1 down through verse 2. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David inquired of the Lord. And the Lord answered, "It is because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites." So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. And now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. The children of Israel had sworn protection to them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. All right, so we're introduced to a point in David's reign where there was a famine. Now, a lot of times famines occurred because of, sometimes famines occurred because, again, God being upset with Israel. You think about during the time when Elijah was the prophet, during the reign of Ahab, remember that there was a drought, I believe, for about 3 years in Israel. And part of that, again, was the punishment that was being delivered because of Israel's wickedness. And so naturally, David recognizes, we're in the midst of a famine. Something's going on that's wrong here. And David then inquires of the Lord to figure out what the problem is. And of course, God just simply notes it's because of the actions of Saul. Saul and his house had sought to kill the Gibeonites. And this is why, and let me just go ahead and clarify this, this is why this section is more than likely does not directly follow the end of chapter 20, because, at the end of chapter 20, it's been a long time since Saul's been alive. But what we're talking about in chapter 21 is sort of a quick punishment that, again, relates back to the house of Saul, which, again, a lot of people think that this chapter chronologically comes sort of at the very beginning of the book of 2 Samuel. But whatever the case may be, God's upset because the Gibeonites, who the text indicates to us, the children of Israel had sworn to protect them. The Israelites had not kept that promise, or at least the house of Saul did not, because they had sought to kill the Gibeonites. Notice that he said, sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. So in order to understand this section, we need to understand who the Gibeonites were. Let me ask you this. Do you recall when the people of Israel made this oath to the Gibeonites? It came under the leadership of one very important figure in Israel's history. Joshua. So, if you would, go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Joshua chapter 9. Because that's where we actually read about this sworn oath of protection. That is in Joshua chapter 9. Now, we're not going to necessarily read through all of this, just due to time constraints. So we can kind of summarize this up a little bit, but it may be helpful to go back and read this later on if you're not that familiar with it. Remember that in the book of Joshua, basically the main task of the people of Israel was to settle the land. And sometimes that meant, what God expected of them when they first entered into the land, is that they had to get rid of the Canaanites, which to a large degree they did. They didn't get rid of everybody, obviously, because that led to idolatry later on. But the Israelites were expected to get rid of all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. However, there were a group of Canaanites that were from the region of Gibeon, hence the name Gibeonites, that understood what Israel was doing. Right? That they were wiping out all these groups of the Canaanites, and the Gibeonites did not want to be exterminated, right? Something we would naturally expect. And so what the Gibeonites decided to do is they decided to basically pretend as though they had just moved into the area from a foreign country. That's what you see basically in verses 3 through 6 of Joshua chapter 9. They basically make their clothes tattered. They wear old sacks, or they travel with older sacks. Their garments, their possessions are sort of rugged and torn. And what it would indicate is that these are a people that have been on the move. They've been traveling. Their luggage, so to speak, has been used very often. And they did that as a way to portray to Joshua and the people of Israel that they had just simply moved into the land of Canaan. Now, to us, that may not be that big of a deal, but keep in mind that the requirement of the people of Israel was to exterminate basically the inhabitants already there in the land of Canaan. They're not out there seeking to wipe out the people in the areas surrounding the land of Canaan. It was only the people in the land of Canaan. And as a result, notice that in verse 7, Joshua 9 and verse 7, because the men of Israel think that the Gibeonites are from a foreign location, notice that the men of Israel, their first response to them is, "You can dwell among us. How can we make a covenant with you?" And what that would indicate to us is that their deception worked in this case. The Gibeonites were successful in getting Joshua and the men of Israel to think that they were a foreign tribe, when in reality they were from the land of Canaan. Notice that in verse 8 they want to be their servants. And you can read through verses 9 down through verse 13, which gives a lot of their explanation. But notice verse 14, notice verse 14. Then the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not ask counsel of the Lord. And that's a very important point, because if they had asked counsel of the Lord, they would have figured out that the Gibeonites were actually inhabitants of the land of Canaan, which meant that they had to be exterminated according to what God commanded the Israelites. They would have had to have been exterminated like the other groups of Canaanites. But again, because they didn't ask counsel of the Lord, they're going to go and make a covenant. That's verse 15. Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the rulers of the congregation swore to them. So whereas God had given them a requirement to go and wipe out all the Canaanites, including the people of Gibeon, now the people of Israel have just made a covenant with them that they will dwell with them. Made a covenant with them to let them live. Notice that in verse 19, well, I will mention verse 16, the people of Israel. That is important. Verse 16, the people of Israel eventually figure out that the Gibeonites were Canaanites. That's the point of verse 16. And so some people complain about this, right? If they're Canaanites, we need to kill them, but what do we do now because we made an oath? We made an oath that we're going to protect them. Notice now, verse 19, that all the rulers said to the congregation, and really to the people complaining, "We have sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel, now therefore we may not touch them, or we may not attack them. This we will do to them, we will let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath which we swore to them." And the ruler said to them, "Let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers for all the congregation, as the rulers had promised them." So basically, the Gibeonites would become servants to the Israelites. They would be in that position, assumed, for a long time in Israel's history. Well, now, knowing Joshua chapter 9 helps us make sense of what's going on in 2 Samuel chapter 21. We just read about the fact that the Israelites have already made this oath that they would protect the Gibeonites, and now, during the reign of Saul, that oath has been broken. The Gibeonites have been pursued after. Again, this is probably earlier in David's reign, and when this famine happens, David is a man of God, wants to figure out what's the problem, and that's the problem. Israel has not kept its promise to the Gibeonites. And so David's response is, we are going to have to figure this out. We need to uphold our end of the deal, so to speak. So notice verse 3. The text says, "Therefore David said to the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? And with what shall I make covenant that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord?" And the Gibeonites said to him, we will have no silver or gold from Saul or from his house, nor shall you kill any man in Israel for us. So he said, whatever you say, I will do for you. Then they answered the king, as for the man who consumed us and plotted against us that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the territories of Israel, let 7 men of his descendants be delivered to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord chose. And the king said, I will give them. So in all this, the Gibeonites are not looking for money in any way. And naturally by that, they're also not asking to be sort of put out of their position within Israel, I guess, in that position of servitude, we might could say. But their only request is that they want to put the sons of Saul to death. Which again is an indication that this is probably an occasion that happens earlier in David's reign. That is their only request. And so 7 men are who they are going to seek after. Now, of course, at this point Saul is dead, but perhaps from the perspective of the Gibeonites, the house of Saul would have included the actions of Saul's sons, who were often, leaders within his government or leaders militarily, and so they could have likely been as complicit in this attack on the Gibeonites as their father Saul had been. And so, thus, the people of Gibeon want to make sure that the guilty is properly punished. Now notice Numbers chapter 35 and verse 33. Numbers chapter 35 verses 32 and 33. This going back to the law of Moses, but this may tie in well here. We'll back up to verse 31. So Numbers 35, 31 through 33. Part of the law indicates to us that you shall not take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. Which that may explain why the Gibeonites did not take any compensation from David because of this law. You cannot take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death. Perhaps again, if Saul's sons had been a part of the bloodshed against the Gibeonites, they were guilty of murder, and the Gibeonites could not take money for ransom. So verse 32, you shall take no ransom for him who has fled to a city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the priest. Notice verse 33, so you shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land, and no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. And perhaps this is the, we're not told why they don't ask for, why they're not just happy with taking money from Saul's house. Perhaps this is what's going into their mind about why they don't want money from Saul's house, why they would rather have those sons put to death. Now, I will say that some point out that at the time of Saul's death, probably several of his sons are not old enough at this point, were not old enough at that point to have any role in that. And that could also potentially be true. And that's something to think about. But whatever the case may be, the Gibeonites feel that the house of Saul, even though Saul's dead, that his sons should be punished for the bloodshed that was inflicted on the Gibeonites. And David's going to indulge in that. That's why he says, verse 6, the king said, I will give them. I will give them to you. But notice verse 7, that the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul. Notice again, why does he do that? Because David's a man who keeps his promises. God expects his people to keep their promises. The king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. So David's not going to break that promise in order to indulge the Gibeonites, but he will hand over the other sons of Saul, which, again, Saul apparently had another son named Mephibosheth. This is not, verse 8, the king took Armani and Mephibosheth, the two sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahalathite, and he delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the hill before the Lord. So, notice that the sons being handed over, 2 of the sons are coming from the concubine of Saul. That was Rizpah. Remember, I believe it was Rizpah that was mentioned back in 2 Samuel chapter 3. I believe it was 2 Samuel chapter 3, right? Where Abner had gone in and basically slept with Rizpah, right? And that was the whole argument between Abner and Ishbosheth that we've already talked about. We've read about Rizpah before. We've read about Michal before, right? Who was Michal married to? Yeah, she was married to David, right? If I'm remembering that correctly, Michal was at one point married to David. But remember that, because of the dispute with, David and Saul, Saul removed Michal from David, and of course, we've already talked about that. But the point being is that these are the children of Saul that, or at least in the grandchildren, the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, would then be grandchildren, right? So the point is, these are the descendants of Saul that are going to be hanged by the Gibeonites as a way to indulge their desire for justice, we might could say. So the New King James has it, they hanged them on the hill before the Lord. So they fell all 7 together and were put to death in the days of harvest, in the first days in the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, when we think about the laws regarding this, certainly hanging was a way that people were put to death in the Old Testament. But the Old Testament was very clear that when it came to whenever somebody was put to death and they were hanged, that it was expected that the body would be removed at the end of the day and then buried, because it would attract scavengers and animals like that. And scavengers were unclean animals too. Another reason why they would do that. So typically when people were when they were hanged and they were put to death that way, it happened earlier in the day and then they would be buried later that day. But that doesn't happen in this case. Notice verse 10, that Saul's former concubine, Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of harvest until the late rains poured on them from heaven. And she did not allow the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beast of the field by night. Now, we're not given a specific time stamp about how long this would have been, but some, at least not directly in the text from my understanding, but some have pointed out that this time when they were put to death, again, the beginning of barley harvest, and then the time given in verse 10, from the beginning of harvest until the late rains poured on them from heaven, over the course of a couple or a few months, some seem to think that the bodies were left hanging there. And obviously you don't want to think about you obviously don't want to think about all the details of that. But notice again that Rizpah, who again two of her sons were the ones put to death. Notice that Rizpah is there basically protecting the bodies from being taken down, and she's also there protecting the bodies from basically having any scavenger to try to go and, obviously eat the remains of the body. Which again is a very gruesome picture to think about. But it also goes to show that, again, Rizpah was a mother that was very loyal to her children and loving to her children. And obviously Rizpah, sort of innocent in all this, right? She's not part of the, it wasn't her fault that the Gibeonites were being afflicted. And it's sort of a really sad verse to read about in verse 10. A mother, still trying to protect the corpses of her sons is a very gruesome but a very sad thing to picture. And it kind of goes to show Rizpah being a mother that cared deeply about her children, being willing to do this. But now David, verse 11, is told about what has happened. David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. Then David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the street of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them up, after the Philistines had struck down Saul in Gilboa. And so he brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from there, and they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin and Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father. So they performed all that the king commanded, and after that God heeded the prayer for the land. Now remember that when it came to David and Jonathan, that they were killed at the end of the book, at the end of 1 Samuel. And when they were killed, and we're specifically told about this about the body of Saul, remember that when the Philistines killed Saul, they basically took his body, specifically his head in particular, and sort of made it into a trophy that was put on display. Read about that at the end of 1 Samuel, I believe, chapter 31, when they did that. But remember that there were men from Jabesh Gilead who, we recall, Saul had saved them back at the very beginning part of his reign, that they actually went and took the body of Saul and returned it back to Israel. And that again is what's being referenced to us in verse 12. That they had gone and recovered the bodies. And so now they're going to get a proper burial, which is now where the bones of Saul, the bones of Jonathan his son from there, and they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged, all the family of Saul, and they give them basically a proper burial, as what's indicated to us in verse 14. Now I know we've kind of mentioned this before, but again, there was a lot of honor in being given a proper burial. If you weren't given a proper burial in the Bible, a lot of times it was an indication that you were either not well liked by people, or sometimes you were not favored by God, or God was not happy with you in a sense. Now obviously we think about Judas Iscariot, right? He goes and hangs himself. His body is just buried in an unmarked place in a field, right? Doesn't get a very honorable death. In the Old Testament, we're probably most familiar at least, with the deaths of Ahab and Jezebel. Remember that Ahab was shot in the chest. He dies in his chariot, and the text indicates to us, I believe this is maybe at the end of 1 Kings, that the dogs licked his blood. Dogs being an unclean animal, that note for us was a lot of times was an indication that an individual was not pleasing to God when they died, based on how they died, if they didn't get a proper burial. Remember that Jezebel, of course, was thrown out of a window The dogs ate up her body. And we know, of course, that Ahab and Jezebel were both very wicked people. And the point being is that, and the Bible indicates to us that they were killed in this way because that's what God wanted. And that was a sign to show that because they didn't get a proper burial, God was disappointed with them. Just like with Judas Iscariot. And so the point being is that it was a very big shame to not receive a proper burial. That's what Rizpah was doing in part, not just, a loving mother defending the corpses of her son, but also the fact that she did not like to think about the idea of her sons being picked apart by scavenger animals, because it was a sign of a very disrespectful way of dying. And that is part of the impulse, or part of the motivation for why she acts the way that she does in verse 10. And perhaps it is also motivation for us, as we've seen with David, that he wanted to honor the house of Saul despite the wickedness that Saul carried out in his life. We saw that by David again killing the man who bragged about killing Saul at the beginning of 2 Samuel. And now we're told here that it's under David's leadership that Saul and his house receive a proper burial, an honorable death. And notice, though, that at the end of it all, that God heeded the prayer for the land. Because all this had started because the people of Israel had not kept that promise to the Gibeonites. And now when the people of Israel have fulfilled that promise, they've dealt with this injustice, now God is at a point where he's ready to heal the land. The famine goes away. And that is a reminder for us as Christians. Obviously, God does not directly deal with us like he did in the Old Testament. But God expects of us to be people that keep our promises. When we don't keep our promises, obviously, it causes people to lose trust in us naturally, right? Because, we're not seen as trustworthy people. And that's never a good thing. But also, we as Christians reflect the light of Christ. Christ was an individual who kept his promises. He was always honest among men. And people that fail to keep their promises, in some cases, do that because of dishonesty. Because they don't want to fulfill, or they don't want to honor the agreement that was made. And like how God's not happy with the Israelites here, God is not happy when we don't keep our promises. And we don't keep those promises because we choose not to keep those promises. And so in my mind, that's the big point of application that comes out of this section. It's about how God values his people and expects them to always keep their promises, whether that's a promise made to God, whether that's a promise made to other individuals. And so in my mind, that's something to think about as you read through this section. Now, with that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we talked about this morning?
Think about Rizpah, her love for her sons even after their death, how loyal she was to them. And contrast her with some mothers today who don't even love their children while they're alive, abandon them, give them away, abort them, whatever. So she sets a great example of being loyal as a mother to her children even after death.
Yeah. And if you think about mothers in the Bible, you probably don't think about the example of Rizpah either. I mean, you think about a mother who loved her children. I don't know how many of you would first turn to 2 Samuel 21 and verse 10 and talk about Rizpah. But yeah, she showed a lot of loyalty to her kids even after death. A lot more loyalty sometimes than some mothers in this law in the when their children are alive. They don't show as much loyalty to their children as Rizpah did, even when her children were dead. But those are things to think about. Next week we'll talk about the end of chapter 21. We'll return to David dealing with the Philistines once again. With that being said, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention this morning.